That's great. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Julian. As I said, before coming onto the call, unfortunately, the council blocks Zoom, so I don't have my slides, so I'm just on my phone. But hopefully, my kind of description will be enough. So yeah, I'm really happy to be invited today. I really approve of kind of the work that Julian's been doing and Tom's been doing. I do think that innovative solutions like clearing systems and alternative currencies have an important role to play in community wealth building. So it's really encouraging to see that this work is going ahead and taking off. So as Julian said, the Community Wealth Building Bill passed in Scotland in February, and so it's been kind of a key milestone in the development of community wealth building in the country. The bill has been discussed since 2023, and after some amendments and discussions, it finally passed unanimously in the Scottish Parliament last month. And so what it means for Scotland is that it's now a legislative requirement that all local authorities and public bodies must pay due regard to the community wealth building legislation, and crucially, the sort of the key step now is that once the bill passes royal assent, so that's basically going to the King for approval, there'll be what's called like a commencement period, which has to take place after the election. So that would be after the 7th of May. Scottish ministers who might be different after the election have a duty to write up what's called a community wealth building statement, which sets out what they intend to do in regard to meeting the requirements of the legislation. So in doing that, they must set out how they intend to reduce economic and wealth inequality in Scotland, and to support individual communities to do this, and also how they intend to support sustainable and inclusive economic growth. And the measures set out clearly that that this guidance applies to all Scottish public bodies. So it's the Scottish National Investment Bank, Scottish Enterprise, the Highlands and Islands Enterprise, as well as the NHS as well. And it places a statutory requirement on all public bodies within a 3-year period to produce their own community wealth building guidance in reference to the legislation. And the key thing about the legislation is that it doesn't aim to be so overly prescriptive. It does leave a lot of room for nuance and for people to continue with certain activities that are already aligned with community wealth building, but might not have been previously put under that banner. But all the future guidance that local authorities put out, or NHS, or colleges or universities, must include how they will use public procurement to facilitate the sort of generation of local wealth and the retention of local wealth through supporting local businesses. And also they have to have policies regarding community asset transfers. So what assets could be transferred to communities, enabling them to generate wealth for their communities. And there's also different requirements in terms of measurements that such as how frequently are community benefit requirements put in public sector contracts, meaning that in exchange for a public sector contract, they have to agree to put certain provisions in, like offering apprenticeships or supporting different community initiatives. Now, sort of the legislation aside, the community wealth building kind of agenda has already been going on even in spite of legislation. Several local authorities have already been active or at the forefront of it prior to any legislation coming in. North Ayrshire in particular, they're the leading authority in Scotland. They started actually in 2020 as an initial pilot scheme for community wealth building, and they've shown that even in 6 years that you can have a significant impact on the local community by adopting community wealth building. So they've within the space of 6 years they've spent tens of millions of pounds more locally with local businesses. They've helped to keep that wealth circulating within the local economy. Now, going forward, it's still obviously in its early stages, and it's difficult to say at the moment how the guidance will develop, because we still need to wait for that statement from Scottish ministers of the direction they want to take it. But I think, as I was at a conference yesterday with the Scottish government, and they were outlining, all the things that are going on, and essentially the bill is sort of a license for people to continue with what they're doing and maybe to push even further. And as Neil McEnroy said, who's one of the leading campaigners for community wealth building in Scotland and the head of the Economic Development Agency for Scotland, has said that it's an evolving movement, and that the legislation provides that kind of basis to continue with it, and even to sort of embolden people to push for more sort of actions and more support. I mean, from the local government perspective, in Moray in particular, where I work, we have had some difficulties in that there's resourcing pressures, especially now when local governments are under significant pressure. Unfortunately, the guidance hasn't included any provisions for financial support for local authorities to implement community wealth building. However, this could be subject to change depending on the degree of pressure for local authorities. But I think the picture has been sort of very patchwork across Scotland, with some local authorities more advanced than others, some holding off until the legislation comes ahead. But I think now that the legislation is there, more and more local authorities will start to move ahead. And one kind of last point to finish on is that the community wealth building bill, soon to be kind of the act and passed as legislation, places a statutory duty not only on local authorities but also enterprise agencies and a whole range of what they call specified public bodies. This could be Crown Estate Scotland, national parks, the police service, all those kind of considered as anchor network institutions, local institutions that have the power to influence employment, local spending and assets. They have to take due regard to community wealth building and also publish their own plans in relation to that. So I'll leave it there. I mean, overall, I think it's an exciting period. There's certainly a lot of potential, and I hope that going forward, kind of the ambition that people have and the aspirations that are there will come to fruition, and that the change that the legislation seeks to bring about will actually be realised. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much, Joseph. As I said, we'll take some questions at the end, because I think we've got quite a packed schedule. So I'd like to now introduce Tom Woodroof, who's from Local Loop, based in Merseyside, a member of the Liverpool City Region data community, who's now going to talk about the data underpinning their work. So over to you, Tom.
Thank you very much, Julian. So as Julian says, I'm Tom Woodroof. I'm a co-founder of Local Loop Merseyside. I'd like to just start by saying thank you very much to Julian and the Liverpool City Region data community for hosting this. It's great to see such a large and broad audience, and I think that's really a testament to the great work which Julian and the rest of the team have done since launching the data community not all that long ago. I'd also, of course, like to thank Joseph for setting me up so nicely to give this presentation on the more data-driven aspects of community wealth building and the potential, particularly for local authorities, to drive change here. I'd also like to acknowledge our partners, local and national. A lot of our work was funded by an Innovate UK grant, and we're also very fortunate to have worked with Liver Labs and also Impact Data Metrics, another Liverpool-based tech company doing fantastic work in the data and economic space. By way of a personal introduction, I moved to Liverpool about 11 years ago now in order to do a PhD in applied nuclear physics at the University of Liverpool. But for the last few years, I've been working at the intersection of money, data, and governance, and Local Loop Merseyside is one of the results of that work. And by the end of this talk, what I'd like to leave you with is a sense that data is necessary, but by no means sufficient in order for community wealth building to go mainstream. What I'll attempt to outline is that mechanisms to support concrete interventions are needed on top of the data, and that these interventions can start with local authorities. I'd like to start by setting a bit of big picture context. There's a researcher called Peter Turchin who has shown that throughout history, inequality has been the single biggest cause of societal instability, polarization, and disintegration. Of course, these are complex dynamics. Societies and politics are very complex, but invariably at the root of many, many crises is extreme inequality. And I think what's happening currently at the moment in the United States is the clearest contemporary example of where that gets you. But Turchin's point is that the problem is not new. And what's more, Turchin outlines that inequality is driven by what he refers to as a wealth pump, which effectively boils down to a financial system that systematically transfers money from the poor to the rich, and currently is operating at an absolutely colossal and global scale. And a really nice way to visualize this is Brett Scott, an anthropologist, talks about this hovering banks image and does a really nice job of conveying the very powerful but quite abstract hold that financial institutions have over the rest of the economy and the way in which they can exploit that position. And so that's all quite gloomy, and of course, raises the question, well, where does that leave community wealth building in the face of the wealth pump? And my view on that is that it means that community wealth building is urgently needed, but also in urgent need of some leverage points. And so the first question is, can we use data to start to understand the wealth pump? Well, the wealth pump operates through many, many channels and at many, many scales. And so getting a complete view of it is probably impossible, but there are some good places to start in understanding how money circulates in and out of local economies. And in particular, government spending data is a really nice resource. That said, government spending is typically understood either at the macro level as aggregate spending or debt, or at the very micro level through contracts with individual suppliers. And if you just have these either statistical or atomic views, you're not really going to get a holistic sense of the dynamics of local economies. And so neither of these data sources are really up to the job here. And so what we need is a new lens on spending, and in particular, a detailed understanding of the financial flows in the real economy, which we refer to as the missing middle lens. And thankfully, there's a statutory requirement in the UK for local authorities to publish all of their procurement payments of more than £500. And this actually provides a really, really nice place to start in understanding local monetary flows. And you can see here, this is just a screenshot of the website on which this data is published. And so it's very, very easy to access this data and to pull it down. And you can immediately do some quite nice visualizations. Having a spreadsheet is quite hard to interpret, but with a bit of effort, you can represent the data as a network. And it's not a particularly complicated network, but all the same, what it shows you is Liverpool City Council right here at the centre, and it shows about £55 million of spending to about 1,000 unique suppliers. And this was just for 1 month in June 2024. And so this immediately gives you a much, much greater sense of the impact and importance of procurement spending, but it still is nothing close to a really, really detailed map of flows. It's still just one data point, or one small set of data points. And so the next obvious question is, well, there are 6 local authorities across Liverpool City Region. There's Liverpool itself, there's St Helens, Halton, Knowsley, Wirral and Sefton. And so what would happen if we aggregated these 6 data sources? Again, this is relatively straightforward to do, but representing it requires a bit more sophistication. And you can see here, with a bit of time, what this software has done is to split out these, or through combining these 6 data sets, it's provided a neat visual representation. And so once the dust has settled on this, we now have a true network view of spending by these key anchor institutions, and that totals about £200 million per month of spending across 4,500 unique suppliers. And so what we've now achieved here is a very partial map of financial flows across the Liverpool City Region economy, and particularly those which originate with local authorities. And immediately we can actually start to make some much more interesting observations about what's going on here. We can see immediately that each council has its own very distinct set of suppliers, although you can see there's a handful of organisations in the centre which have done very well and managed to get contracts with a couple of councils. But for the most part, each council operates with its own procurement set. And you can also imagine, if you wanted to enrich this picture, you could feed in other anchor institutions, universities and hospitals, etc. And you could imagine that they would broadly look quite similar to this. And of course, where things could get really interesting, and we'll return to this later, if you actually went and talked to these suppliers themselves and started to collect their buying and selling data, and then you'd really start to begin to have a very, very detailed, granular map of local economic flows. But the other thing which becomes immediately obvious just from this initial representation is that there's actually quite a lot of connectivity between the councils themselves. What really jumps out of these strong lines going from council to council. And so we've got an immediate clue that actually there's quite a lot of potential interest in examining that closely. And it's really this connectivity where things get really, really interesting. And so that's what we'll move on to next. And it actually turns out that this connectivity is not necessarily a good thing. You might immediately think, oh, it's fantastic. These 6 authorities spending money with each other. Clearly, from a community wealth building point of view, that sounds like a really, really good thing. And in many ways it is. But unfortunately, this connectivity does have some unintended consequences. In particular, if you think about that connectivity in terms of the debts the councils owe to each other, you can well imagine that you end up with something a bit like a debt spaghetti, is the term we use to refer to this. And this has a few unfortunate outcomes for an institution which is caught up in a situation where it simultaneously has large amounts of money it owes to others, but is also owed by others. They find themselves in a bit of a predicament very often. And so the upshot of this is that gridlock debts create huge amounts of risk, and this manifests as late payments, possibly to each other and potentially to local business suppliers, uncertain cash flow, balance sheet risk, and an overall fragility within the network itself. And the really vicious thing about this is that with this network lens, you can see how actually encouraging local supply chains can make this gridlock problem worse. And this will actually create more opportunities potentially for wealth extraction, because financial services are all too eager to come in and offer remedies to these problems, all of which provides yet another vector for money to leak out of the local economy. And so my contention actually is that unless the network dynamics of local monetary flows are well understood, unintended consequences such as debt gridlocks could in fact prevent community wealth building policies from succeeding and going mainstream. And in worst case, they could even lead to a backlash, with the experience being something like an anchor institution saying, well, I tried spending within a local anchor network, but actually they're all cash strapped too, and we just can't afford or coordinate to pay each other. And so let's take a look at this inter-council connectivity and see if there's anything which can be done about this unfortunate predicament. So we zoom right in, we eliminate all of the payments to business suppliers, and we focus solely on the money which the 6 Liverpool City Region councils are sending to each other. And what this reveals is that just in this month, June 2025, there's about £2.1 million of inter-council spending, which is about 1% of the 200 million total. So it's a small fraction, but in absolute terms, it's really a very large amount of money which the councils are sending to and from each other. But we can see immediately it's a really, really strongly connected network. What we have here is a real debt spaghetti. And at the bottom, we have a classic gridlock. Knowsley owes Halton, and Halton in return owes Knowsley. And so the question here is, well, who's going to pay first? And that's bad enough when there's just 2 people caught in a gridlock. But if you start to trace the debts, you can see that actually Knowsley owes money to Liverpool, and in turn Liverpool owes money to Halton. And so now we're really in trouble. It's not obvious who has to move first. It will depend on possibly who's got the most ready cash available and some slightly tricky coordination. And of course, this is even before we include all of the other debts from all the other 3 councils. And really, frankly, this is a bit of a disaster for community wealth building, because it means that the councils might have to borrow in order to meet their obligations to each other. The productivity is going to be lost because there'll be a huge amount of wasted time from trying to coordinate to untangle this mess. And it's quite likely that suppliers are going to suffer and get paid late as a side effect of this, and create a ripple effect of late payment across the local economy. And again, this just creates more opportunities for the wealth pump to operate through various financial services, which basically serve to extract wealth. So taking a pause at this point, we've done some mapping and we've revealed a problem. Our question is, how do we intervene in this effectively? And for that, we need a mechanism. And the mechanism which is best suited to addressing this problem is known as clearing. And what that really boils down to is institutions working together to discharge the maximum debt with the minimum cash. And in fact, what's really interesting is that clearing takes advantage of these exact same gridlocks we saw, whereby we had this loop between Knowsley and Halton, and it flips the dynamic around and turns these gridlocks from a source of risk and a threat into an opportunity. And within a very, very tight clustered network like this, there are actually many loops. This loop of 2 at the bottom is just a simple example. And if we run a dedicated clearing algorithm, what we can do is reveal the optimal set of loops. And what this effectively shows is the total amount of debt across the network, which could be discharged without any payments being made at all. And in this particular network for this particular month, that is about £240,000 of debt. So about 11% of all inter-council debt. And what happens when you remove these loops, which is achieved through a simple bookkeeping operation, is that you not only reduce the debt by a substantial fraction, but the residual debts left behind are now much simpler. And so these remaining debts can be paid without these gridlocks interfering and slowing everything down. And so what you've achieved is a significant reduction in risk to the timely payment of the remaining debts, but also you've significantly shrunk the balance sheets of the councils participating in clearing. And so the overall outcome is to transform interconnectivity from a source of risk into a financial superpower. And we'll just have a quick look at the breakdown of this £240,000 figure I mentioned. One of the very strong characteristics of a clearing mechanism like this is that the results vary quite widely. You can see that St Helens in principle clears everything. It wouldn't have had to have made any payments at all to the other LCR councils for this month. Liverpool also does very well. It clears almost 98% and in absolute terms clears the most. But then right at the other end of the spectrum, Sefton clears nothing at all. And the reason for this is that although it owes money to other councils, no other councils in this month owed it money, and it therefore cannot participate in loops and therefore cannot benefit from clearing. And then the final observation is that although Wirral clears a very small amount in percentage, in absolute terms, it's second only to Liverpool. And that's because of the presence of a single enormous payment for £1.9 million for waste processing services, which happened to occur this month and which enabled a large amount of clearing to take place. If we extrapolate these results, LCR councils could, in principle, clear something around £2.9 million annually, and estimating LCR as perhaps 1% of UK GDP, the total inter-council clearing opportunities across the UK could be around £300 million annually. And of course, this is a significant outcome for balance sheets and reducing reliance on central government funding, and of course, the ability to deliver services. Beyond directly helping with a local authority health, there are quite a few CWB follow-ons, in particular, including local SME suppliers in the clearing network will improve the results. In fact, building an SME clearing network is the core purpose of the Local Loop Merseyside platform. For SMEs participating in this, clearing means faster payment of invoices, reduced risk of insolvency, less reliance on costly and scarce external financing, insulation from credit crunches, and incentives to trade locally. And of course, all of these are direct community wealth building outcomes and would typically be understood in terms of the local multiplier effect. And as called for in response to the Scottish Government CWB bill, what this does is create a genuine alignment between policy and SMEs and grassroots community groups, and a basis for collaboration between them in service of community wealth building objectives. And we can also be confident that the potential unintended consequences of community wealth building in the form of these payment gridlocks has been eliminated through the clearing process. So this presentation is really just a snapshot of what's possible based on some early work. The opportunities for community wealth building, starting with anchor institutions, are absolutely huge once we pay attention to data and once we bring the right mechanisms into play. And so I would like to stop there and say that I'm very much looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Tom. And thank you very much, Joseph, as well, for your presentations. Would you like to stop sharing now? Oh, brilliant. We've already got Patrick straight in there. I thought I'd have to prepare a question to get in there. So, Patrick, would you like to ask your question, please? Thank you.
Yeah, cheers, Julian. Thank you so much. Directed at Joseph rather than Tom, I think, is in the first instance. Two slightly related points. One pithy and one slightly more long-winded. The pithy one, there's a tension between the importance of local decision-making and devolution and the fact that there's a statutory approach to this on a national basis, because it's not beyond the realms of possibility that you're going to get local authorities that, candidly don't give a damn about inequality. And they're going to be found to have a statutory basis on which they can put a 50-page document together saying, thanks very much, Mr. Holyrood, but we don't give a damn about what you're telling us to do here. And so there's that tension there. And I think that it's a great idea, but whether or not the statutory approach just means more paperwork and more council officers saying, we don't want to do this, sorry, but, over the course of 60,000 words rather than 2 seconds. The slightly more long-winded critique I've got of community wealth building is that local doesn't necessarily mean more equal, because I was on Liverpool Council for 12 years, and in those 12 years, I was being asked to procure locally. And I'll give one example, and it's a kind of a it's not a hypothetical, but it's a really good way of articulating the issue. Liverpool Council was being asked to procure tarmac road resurfacing services locally, and so was Knowsley, and so was Warrington, and so was Wigan, and so was everywhere in the north of England. And they can't all procure locally, because if they all procure locally, you end up with 50 different tarmac companies across the north of England that have all got different bases on different industrial estates with different corrugated iron roofs. They've all got payment processors behind the scenes. They've all got receptionists. And you're not taking advantage of the economies of scale that would be achieved if you only had a couple, 2 or 3 of these companies sending the services out across the whole of the north of England. You're not taking advantage of the benefits of specialisation in the division of labour, where people get to know what the job is, they become expert in it because they're doing it all the time. You ended up with 50 or 60 amateur tarmacking companies, which aren't necessarily doing the job, firstly, efficiently, but secondly, to a professional standard. And you're not getting this comparative advantage that we all want to see in economics, where you're trading with each other. The other issue is that if you are procuring locally, you may be procuring from a company that has a 50-to-1 ratio in terms of the wage differential between the chief exec and the lowest of the lowest paid, like cleaner or administrator. Whereas if you're procuring more widely afield geographically, you may actually be procuring from a provider that's got a much lower ratio from top to bottom. And so the local doesn't necessarily mean more equal. So I would suggest that maybe a way of improving community wealth building would be to have some sort of trusted trader scheme or an accreditation scheme across local authority areas and maybe across the whole country, rather than almost giving too much credit and too much weight to local geographies rather than the specifics of the types of company that you might be wanting to get involved in there. I've finished being long-winded, so thank you there.
Yes, I'll try to remember the first question. So I think your first question was, whether being statutory makes a difference or not. And I do think, I can't speak on behalf of the Scottish Government because I'm not, I'm a local government sort of officer. But I do feel that, yes, just because it's statutory doesn't necessarily mean that, community wealth building will be fully kind of implemented or adhered to in kind of the spirit that the bill was devised. I think I also have experience of that in local government, that there is some sort of a bit of a selective attitude to what is statutory and what is not. Economic development is a statutory requirement on local governments, but at times it's not fully given the sort of importance that it deserves. I think for me the main thing with the legislation is that it provides support to those initiatives that are already in place, and it gives people the framework and the groundwork to actually progress the work that they're doing. From my own personal perspective, because I started in this job early last year, and I had a difficulty in, we'd written a strategy, we had a community wealth building strategy, we had the action plans, and I was there to implement it, but simply because it didn't have that statutory backing, it was much further down the pecking order than other aspects of the council's business. So I think now that it has become statutory, and and the few months leading up to it being passed, it has helped me, as personally as a community wealth building officer, to take actions forward, on the basis that this is now a statutory requirement. We have to take it seriously. We have to pay due regard to it. Even beyond the benefits that it potentially holds for the council and for Moray in general. So on your second question, which I believe is sort of, questioning sort of whether local spending is always kind of the best outcome. And, I don't see that, it's good to be sort of puritanical on these things. I think you've got to definitely take a nuanced approach, to local spending. I think that it should be sort of, considered in the widest possible context, and at the same time, you want the best possible service and value for money, but also you want to support local businesses. And I think that, there can be a danger if there's too much focus on, driving to spend more locally at a very small scale sort of level, within, say Moray or Aberdeenshire or, other places in Scotland. I do think that, you have to take that dual approach between the local area and also, regional spend. And it all has to be, justified on the basis that it both makes economic sense, and also that it, ties in with, wanting to support the local economic area. Because at the end, you also want to procure goods and services that are right for the job that needs to be done. And I think that if you're just, trying to spend locally for the sake of it, even if, there's not that, there's not the capability or capacity or, the same standards available in the local area to achieve that, then I think that, you run the risk of actually undermining the whole community wealth building agenda. So I do think there has to be, a degree of sort of pragmatism around that. But I certainly think, for Moray Council in particular, we, have a target to spend 30% locally, so it's not, we're not sort of striving to become, like an autarkic, fully insulated sort of local authority. But, we'll spend a significant amount outside of Moray, but we've considered, looking at the figures and looking at the local business base and what is realistic. We think that 30%, local spend is a realistic target. So yeah, I mean, I do agree with your point about, paying due attention to sort of economies of scale, and also, the structures within companies. And you could also raise the fact that, a company could be registered locally, but it could have shareholders from all over the world. So that, there's all kinds of different nuances that you have to look at. But I think as a general principle, especially in a time when, council budgets and public sector budgets are under strain, looking at how you can use those sizable budgets to achieve other objectives, sort of addressing inequality, addressing, health and social issues. I think that it's important to have that kind of local focus where appropriate. So I hope that has answered your question, if I could fully remember it.
Thanks, Joseph. Tom, I don't know whether you want to add to that at all.
Yes, very briefly. Thank you for the question, Patrick, and the observations. I think you're exactly right to recognise that we must not be simplistic here. All of the things you said about economies are absolutely true. They are inherently complex, and being reductionist about it is inevitably going to backfire in one way or another. I think what's some of the work which I'm aware of around social value procurement is precisely to try and take a more nuanced view of what good procurement looks like, and taking into account factors beyond just whether a business is or is not local. And I know that we've got some people in the audience who are very expert on social value procurement, so I'm not going to attempt to talk about that. But to the best of my knowledge, there are serious attempts underway to try and use data to get very meaningful social value metrics which can guide procurement in more sophisticated ways.
Thanks, Tom. I've got a question, if I may, and I think it's about, it's a data question, and it would be from myself. So who are the kind of the anchor institutions who are compelled to release data, spending data? Because obviously you gave a partial picture of local authority spend, but are other anchor institutions compelled to spend that data? Because surely if there was a richer network, then you'll get more nuanced partnerships between local economy actors, say a higher education or a health trust, to work together to identify those loops within their economies.
Yeah, it's a bit of a muddy picture. So it seems that the local authorities must. It has to be said they're not always particularly quick about it. They don't seem to have to publish it in any standardized format, and so the data is not particularly clean, but it is there and it does appear eventually. I have been pointed at data sets from Mersey Travel, and I believe the Merseyside Police and Crime Commissioner has published data. I haven't been able to find anything from the NHS or the universities, so it doesn't appear that they have any obligation to publish anything at all. But you're exactly right, Julian. The more data you can throw in, the richer your picture and the better the opportunities present themselves. I suspect that the best place to be working on this would be with an anchor procurement network, of which I'm aware that some regions do have them. I'm not aware of one in Merseyside, but I imagine that if you were to find an anchor procurement network which was willing to have all of its members publish data, you would then get an extraordinarily powerful view of what's going on.
Thank you. I see David's got his hand up.
Thanks, Julian. Yeah, I'm David Randall from Crystallizer, which is a co-op which is devoted to community wealth building. That's our mission. And we're place-based, and we're only in South London, the South London Partnership. But interestingly, the 5 boroughs in our sub-region declared last year they were going to set up an anchor network. And this is work in progress. And it would be very helpful if, as a sort of community of activists, including everybody in this call, who's really interested in progressing in community wealth building, if we could get a set of metrics together that embrace community wealth building as a whole, not just procurement. But let's look at land and property. Let's look at good jobs created. We could come up with our own set of metrics if we didn't necessarily agree with those that are being promoted elsewhere. But it would give us something to work from and something with which to create a kind of baseline study, well, before we went too deeply down a particular rabbit hole, which could be procurement, because people tend to, it's like low-hanging fruit, the procurement issue, but it's not necessarily even the most impactful as far as community wealth building is concerned.
Tom or Joseph, do you want to follow up on that?
I can quickly follow up. I think it's definitely something that I've found that as it's sort of going forward, that you really need to have some sort of common definition of what we're trying to do, what are the measurements, and how do we measure kind of success or of community wealth building. I mean, in the community wealth building bill, the Scottish Government have set out a whole range of measures that could be included within the local authority development community wealth building plans, but they've tried not to be like overly prescriptive about it. So there are key metrics such as public procurement to SMEs or to local businesses, and kind of the number of contracts including fair work. But I do think that there needs to be some degree of standardization, so we kind of know that we're comparing apples with apples and not apples with oranges.
Yeah, absolutely. To add to that, it is a difficult problem, choosing some metrics in order to baseline and therefore be able to evidence that what you've done has actually made an impact is almost certainly going to be very, very, very difficult. There's one metric which I'm aware of, which I think could be key to this, which is, I think many people in CWB will know all about the local multiplier effect, but there's some fairly recently research published on deriving a local multiplier effect from network-based data, which I suspect, without having looked into it too deeply, is actually probably a very, very robust way of trying to measure community wealth building outcomes. And what's really interesting about the network-based approach is that I think it also provides a lens on the circular economy. And when you see the circulation of wealth and money, both as being a multiplier effect from a community wealth building angle, but also as a very literal understanding of the material circular economy, and that networks are the lens through which both of these policies can be kind of unified and understood and driven. I think it's things like the local multiplier effect which will provide the most robust and insightful metrics into the dynamics of the system. But I'm sure there's a huge amount of open-ended research to be done in this direction.
Thank you, Tom.
Thank you, Tom. Right. Well, I'm going to draw to a close the formal bit of the meeting. We will be continuing for half an hour afterwards for people to kind of carry on asking questions. I know that Joseph, you said you had to leave at 2.
Yes, but I'll leave my email in the thread if anybody wants to.
Please do
reach out.
Do leave your email. And I just got a few notices, and also if anybody's got any community notices they want to bring to the rest of the group, please do post them in the chat. Obviously everybody's doing really interesting stuff, and it's always good to know about what people are doing, how people get involved, if there's any events coming up or any resources that they would be interested, that people would find of interest. So please do, because sharing is caring, so to speak. Right, I'm just going to quickly share my screen because I've got a couple of notices, and also see my terribly cluttered desktop. Right, so we've got that. Yes, so we do monthly events as stated, and also quarterly in-person events. We do have an event coming up which is looking at the environment and how potentially data can help save the environment, or help us understand the environment and what needs to be done: climate mitigation, climate forecasting, climate modelling, etc. And so we've got contributions from Carbon Happy World, who are a Liverpool-based AI and carbon organisation, and also Natural Environment Research Council's Digital Solution Hub. So please do join us then if you can. Also, we do have a survey. I kind of ask people to fill this in if they can. Primarily, it provides justification for us to be able to do these things. There's a lot of people who volunteer time, and there's a lot of resource that goes into organising these things. So please do send us your feedback, especially because it allows us to help. It helps with programming as well. So if there's things that you want to see that perhaps we could do as an event, please do put it in. And I will stop sharing there. So now that business is done. Carry on with the conversation. It almost seems like an advertising break, really. But there you go, Paul.
Blessings from Ireland. Can you hear me well? Great, thank you. Congratulations to everybody that's doing amazing work. I'm curious, I'm only looking at procurement data there, and we're dealing with the work of Silvio Gazelle, who created a currency. Best example, I think, is probably Virgil in Austria in 1931. I'm curious, is anybody doing anything about creating a local currency as well as setting up settlement for the councils as well?
Anybody? I know within the Les, is that you responding to Paul's comment? Would you like to say more
Yes.
about
I've just been commissioned by my local authority in Hackney, and I'm creating a traders association for a main road of shops. And within that, I'm creating a community currency under the direction and model of Michael Linton of the original local exchange trading systems, which is now open money. So it's a community wealth building, but community, not wealth, but community money in circulation. without clearing.
Thanks. Just double checking. You're not adding in clearing as well. You're just launching the local token.
A local currency, yes, with the specific aim of helping local good causes.
Great, thanks. I've got another question, if I may, Tom, and I think I've briefly mentioned this before, and it's about liquidity within local economies, and obviously, I suppose liquidity is the lubrication that makes economies work. So how does this foregrounding these networks aid liquidity?
Yeah, and that is an absolutely foundational question. Several ways to respond to that. I guess a way to start is just to observe that liquidity is absolutely essential, but it's also very expensive. Money is inherently scarce. There's never quite enough to go around, and it's costly in one way or another. What clearing does effectively is it looks at the network structure and says, what is the least amount of liquidity we need in order for all of us to pay our debts? We're in this situation where we buy and sell from each other, and that creates debts, and we all need to pay each other. To pay, we need liquidity, but liquidity is scarce and costly. But by looking at the network structure, what the loop actually corresponds to is liquidity embodied within the network itself. It's an opportunity for debts to be discharged without the need for cash payments. And so the kind of systemic effect of clearing across an entire trading network, as I say, is to minimize the need for any form of external financing in order for people to settle up their debts. And it's great, but it is only a start. In a typical trading network, in a business trading network, you might expect clearing to eliminate between 10 and 20% of debt for the typical participant, which is pretty significant. You know, that could well be the difference for a business between staying in business or going insolvent, particularly during a cash flow crunch. But it's not the whole story. In order to discharge the remaining majority of the debts, you do need some form of liquidity. And that will actually be the second stage of local loop, is once we've got the loop clearing system up and running, we will then start to say, how can we use the very same network analysis to optimally route liquidity through the remaining debt network? In other words, how can we coordinate and target payments such that everyone gets paid much, much faster and with much less risk, and yet still needing only a fraction of the liquidity they would have needed had there been no coordination at all. And so really clearing comes down to being a coordination mechanism around liquidity.
So in taking that a little bit further, so this network optimization works best if you can internalize the flows of money within the system.
That's right. Yes, exactly. So this, yeah.
Go on, Karen.
So exactly. So this is the whole insight underlying the flipping of the dynamic in favor of community wealth building. Is at the moment, the more of your business you do within the network, the more likely you are to get caught in a gridlock and therefore be paid late or have to pay someone else late. But actually, once you have a clearing mechanism, all of your incentives are now to trade within the network, because the more of your business you can do within the network, the less reliant you are on external forms of liquidity, and the more likely you are to get paid faster and have better cash flow. And so for me, this is why, as a mechanism, it's absolutely integral to community wealth building, because it rewards connectivity rather than punishes it.
Would that offer the infrastructure for a barter system as well?
Potentially, yeah. So the next step beyond that is saying, okay, we've minimized the need for liquidity through clearing. Next, we want to introduce some liquidity in order to be able to pay the large remaining majority of debts which couldn't be cleared. The question is, what is the nature of that liquidity? The obvious thing, of course, is it's pounds GBP, because everyone will just accept them, and you can use very standard payment rails. with the appropriate regulation, etc. But then the obvious follow-on question becomes, well, what if we could have forms of liquidity which were created within the network itself? And that's where you start to move towards mutual credit systems and potentially barter systems. But with barter, of course, it's almost by definition, you don't have a common unit of account. You are just swapping commodity A for commodity B. And what that means is that you can't really include, there's no kind of means of payment being created there. And that means you can't be treated as liquidity within the network, but you could nonetheless use your knowledge of the network structure to spot opportunities for barter and thereby not rely on any form of liquidity if that was what you were aiming for. So you could build a more resilient and effective barter network using these insights. It wouldn't necessarily integrate that well. It might not be all that self-sufficient and self-sustaining, but you would at least have a better understanding of what's more or less likely to work.
I've got a question or a comment. Well, this is more a question from Sana. Do you want to say this? What do you? So Sana said, where would? Is that where?
Sorry, yeah. So that was just in.
You say it better than me.
Yeah, sorry. It was just because I'm not always the greatest at speaking in these kind of situations. But yeah, what as Tom knows, what we're setting up is a circular arts network, so sharing of materials and resources. So when like commodities and stuff was mentioned, then like kind of instead of money, I was just wondering if that was something that then that's where we could come in, where in terms of like at the minute I'm trying to find a home for a kiln and like kind of that trying to sort of like that sharing of resources. I don't really know how it fits in. I just kind of saw that it potentially that was where it could slot in.
Yeah, I think the most obvious thing you'd be able to do here would be not so much creating kind of new exchange per se, but making it much easier to find people who'd be willing to accept those resources which you've got. So, for example, you could look at the participants in the network, because effectively it forms an incredibly rich directory of local businesses, community groups, anchor institutions, etc. And that might make it much easier to coordinate and possibly broker connections across the network and say, oh, we've got this, we've got these resources which we've saved from an office clear out, for example, and we would like to find a home for them in the arts community. Can we use our knowledge of the connections within the local economic network in order just to make that a lot cheaper and faster than it would otherwise be? I think that would probably be the place to start.
Isn't that a crucial point with a lot of economic arguments? It's about the kind of information exchange. So it's about what you're saying, what you're doing is making something that's kind of previously invisible or only partially known visible to enable more efficient transaction, not even necessarily economic, but also social as well.
Yeah, I think this is where you start to get into potentially some kind of very interesting, I suppose, politically flavored discussions. People who traditionally would have been very in favor of extremely decentralized market-driven economies, because they say exactly it's all about information processing, and only people who are hyper-local can really understand what's going on and make good decisions, versus people on the traditional left who would say, no, you can do central planning. If you just have enough knowledge of the economy, you can get together and you can actually plan things deterministically and rigidly. I think what's really interesting is that the network view doesn't really belong to either. It's not at all for planning, because the network is inherently complex and borderline chaotic. So you cannot just look at the network and say, I know exactly what to do now. I'm going to do intervention X and it's guaranteed to get me outcome Y. It simply doesn't work like this. But at the same time, it is much less, it does reveal a lot of things which could potentially enable decision making in a coordinated way at a greater scale than people who would be entirely individualistic about things would normally think possible. So not quite sure if that's a direct answer, but I think it does take you into some very interesting questions.
Well, yeah, I suppose it's a democratization of that knowledge, I think, because generally it's a few have access to that information.
Right.
and so it's kind of, it's a way that you create this open resource, this commons. Someone mentioned it earlier actually, and I'd love to have a commons discussion, but
that actually sets me up really nicely to say the other really important component of this, of course, is the data governance. Who owns the data? Who gets to derive value from its insights? And that's something which we take very, very seriously. And so we've set Local Loop up as a data mutual. And so the business members who participate by sharing their invoice data to build the map and derive benefits from clearing, they themselves they participate in the governance of that data set and its uses. Because, at the moment, the situation is there are institutions which have this kind of data. The banks have something comparable. They, of course, see all of the payment flows. The big accounting software companies, which are increasingly used for invoicing, in principle, they have this data as well, because that's where it's increasingly being generated. I'm not aware of any community grassroots initiatives which have seen the opportunity here to aggregate this data and put it to use for the community in this manner.
Thanks. Paul.
Thanks, Tom. Tom, I think it's a question for you. You mentioned community wealth building, and assuming all those Liverpool councils agreed to go into a settlement system and they cleared 100% of their obligations. How does it get to members of the community? Because the payment only goes as far as the SME owner. And as we famously know, shareholders actually don't share. So how does it get to the community?
The analysis and the data I built off doesn't actually say anything specific about that. It kind of just says this is the public procurement spending as it is. The governance and the management of those businesses who are being procured from is not kind of taken account of, so to speak. You could imagine, and I think this is probably where the social value calculations would come in. You could in principle look at those suppliers to the council and say, well, are any of these cooperatives, are they CICs? Do they provide a living wage, for example? And that might well be taken into account, but there's no immediate answer within the data, which I've been looking at here.
Thanks, Tom. If I could follow on, so the numbers that you showed there, let's say 200 million a month for the Liverpool councils, how big is that in comparison to what is the Liverpool economy as a whole? So much is going through Liverpool as a whole, of which you're just showing the 200 million for the council procurement. Do you have any idea what that number is?
I actually don't know what Liverpool GDP is off the top of my head. I don't know if anyone in the audience has a figure.
I would think it would be quite large. I was tempted to do a search on the internet, but
yeah, be interesting to know, and see what the contribution is.
Why did you resist your temptation?
Because, I don't know, actually. I don't know.
Go for it, buddy. It's a community of practice. We should be practicing.
Should be practicing, but it's like the person when you're out and you're having an argument with somebody and it just carries on, and it's like the person who reaches for the internet loses.
Oh, I see. I'll give you a leprechaun economics version if you want. Okay, so this is the Irish economic system. Irish economic system, top line 650 billion. Okay, but 350 billion of that are American corporates. Okay. So the actual GDP of the real people in Ireland on the ground is about 250 or 300. So I'm just curious, what is the equivalency in Liverpool?
So we've got two responses, one from Alex and one from Nicholas. It's around 33 to 35 billion per year. And I've got it.
So we're saying that the numbers for Liverpool County Council are 200 a month, so that's maybe 1.2. Let's double it to 2 billion. So the procurement is 2 billion out of 35 billion on the back of a napkin. And what I'm curious about then is, the other 33 billion. What are the opportunities for settlement to take place between individuals and between the SMEs themselves?
Well, well, within that economy, you've got other anchor institutions as well, NHS trusts, which obviously have a huge budget. You say universities, and there's a lot of central government as well within the local economy as well. So, but yeah,
I think my co-founder found a figure which was that this is an estimate derived because there are no direct figures we could find, but we did our best to come up with something reasonable. Was that at any given time there's about £200 million worth of outstanding invoice debt between Liverpool City Region businesses.
Just wondering as well if there's a way to like kind of similar to what Kindred have been doing in terms of their like sort of social value paying back of debts and stuff. I was wondering if there could be something where that could be kind of part of the kind of clearing system as well, where people could kind of pay off their debts using social value. Would be an interesting concept.
Absolutely. Yeah. You could absolutely design something like that. What's really interesting is that once you've started building the network view of debts, you have a lot of options to include what a debt is, basically. The data I was showing was spending debts by local authorities. Local Loop is based on collecting B2B invoice data, but you could well imagine, exactly as you say, Sana, participants in the network declaring that they owed each other money, which was denominated in pounds, but which could have arisen as a result of some other activity. And that could also be included in the clearing network and would potentially benefit not just those two participants, but also the wider economic community. And you could even imagine saying, how can we build connections across the network in order to create new clearing loops so that as many people as possible benefit? And so the possibility of effectively kind of gardening the network structure and deciding what that means and on what terms absolutely becomes real.
So we worked on a project called it was a data standard actually. It was called 360 Giving, which was about grant giving and philanthropy and how grants are dispersed within local areas. And I'm just wondering whether what the data could also be used for would be to identify points of risk. I mean, I know with the community wealth building, it's slightly different, but it's also allowed grant funders to identify who needed support more effectively. So I'd assume it's a similar kind of model. Not that they did, of course. that was just theoretical. That was the theory. But I assume this way of working would enable points of risk to be identified and then worked and mitigated against, I suppose.
Yeah, absolutely. This is another possible follow-on using the same data. Once you have the data, you can do a whole variety of things. Clearing is just the first. And what's really interesting is that in many European economies, there are very strong reporting requirements to central government around business activity. So a business issues an invoice and it has to effectively CC the government in. And that makes it possible to do something very similar to what we've been talking about here, but obviously at a much larger and more granular scale. And the link I've just put in the chat is exactly this. Some researchers took this data and they identified the hotspot risks in the Hungarian economy and said, which are the critical businesses? It's a bit like too big to fail in the financial sector. It's like which institutions, if they went under, would blow up the economy. And they found, not surprisingly, it was a tiny number of businesses which occupy these really systemically important positions in the network. And it's not always the obvious suspects. Sometimes you get very, very small, very niche businesses, which because of their particular connections to customers and suppliers are actually a massive source of risk, but possibly an invisible one. And so you could well imagine a local authority, but you also mentioned funding bodies, finding out which of these, and it might not even be commercial risk, it could be a community group playing a key role, deciding in some way which entities in the local economy were absolutely indispensable, and ensuring that liquidity in the first instance, but also possibly other kinds of support, were routed towards them to prevent the possibility of them going under and causing a crisis. And this is research which I would love to be able to do at some point in the not too distant future on the Liverpool City Region economy.